Module 7, Dimension Styles and Variables. Today we're going to look at Chapter 29 on Dimension Styles and Variables, and we're going to link those to this mechanical and this architectural drawing as examples. We can go to our textbook, AutoCAD Instructor, and look at Chapter 29, and they have a number of learning objectives here to be able to control dimension variable settings using the Dimension Style Manager, to be able to save dimension styles, create families, apply dimension style overrides, being able to work with updates, guidelines, annotative dimensions, and isometric dimensions. And it's a pretty ambitious list. And so essentially we're going to look at how to work with dimension styles within the Dimension Style Manager. As we look at the concepts, AutoCAD's dimensioning capabilities are excellent. It allows you to detail drawings that are either architectural or mechanical or civil, and that's one of the appeals to using AutoCAD, is that it has very strong support for creating dimensioning in artistic expression with AutoCAD. And so as we start to work with AutoCAD dimension styles, we'll use this style manager, and what we'll do is we'll go through and be able to set things up with lines, symbols and arrows, text, fit, primary units, alternate units, and tolerances. And so the textbook does a good job of explaining all the details, but it really doesn't get too far to the point until we get to page 789. So we're going to go to page 789. And we're going to take a look at the Dimension Style Manager, because we want to start with the basics. They really drill into a lot of specifics in the first few pages, and it's a bit overwhelming. And so we're going to take a look at the Lines tab, okay? And when we look at an AutoCAD drawing, and so if we took a architectural drawing, and then we went to Model Space, I'm going to change the color. And so we have this drawing of a couple of doors, okay? And so one of them is 2 feet 6 inches wide by 6 feet 8, and the other 7 feet by 3 feet. And then if we look at our Annotate tab, our Dimension Style Manager is right here, and we can activate that either by typing DDIM or by clicking on this arrow right here. And so if we click on the arrow, we can see our dimension styles that are currently within this drawing. And I'm just going to start with the standard, and I'm going to go and modify the standard. And we'll start with lines on the left-hand side. And so for lines, what we can do is we can basically set the line types, and we want to leave them as continuous or by block, and by block would be continuous. Same things with the line weights. And as you look at these different style boxes, they control certain variables. And so this would be dimension lines. And so these are your dimension lines. Extension lines would be this line that comes out here, and that would be your extension line. And then extend beyond the dimension lines is the amount of overhang. So there's not a really great amount of detail in the first page. You can maybe change the color of things, and you'll see it update as it goes through and does it. But for the most part, we don't do too much with the first tab. On symbols and arrows, when we're working with architectural drawings, we typically use these oblique or architectural ticks. And so you can set those for architectural ticks, or we could change them to a different type of terminator. And so you can use dots, but standards are typically architectural ticks. And then for leaders, we'll leave those as arrowheads. And so when we start to work with different arrowheads and things like that, we're going to want to have close-filled arrowheads for leaders. And I'm not sure why that's not showing there. Center marks are what's created when we create a circle and we click on it with the center mark tool. It'll either create a mark or a line. A line will look like that. A mark will look like that. And then it'll give us an update as far as to what that will look like. And that's about what we want to work with on this area. We're not going to work so much with dimension break or arc length symbols or jog dimensions. The text area is where we would set up the font for the text, and so it also has styles. And so if we wanted to look at the standard style on this drawing, it's set for Arial. But if we wanted to change that text font, we could go and leave it at standard and change it to something like City Blueprint, which looks like a hand drawing. And then you'll have some of the factors that are involved, but you want to leave the text height 0 when you set a text style. We're going to apply that and close it. And so that just updated the text font. And then as we look at some of these other informations, we can change the colors, which we really don't want to do. Text height, typically standard height would be 0.125 or 1/8, and we'll just say 0.125. And then text placement, we can set that as either centered, which would be centered within the dimension, and then we could have that centered whether it's a vertical dimension or a horizontal dimension. I typically like to have the text alignment as horizontal. And then on the Fit tab, we can adjust things like whether the arrows are pointing in or the arrows are pointing out, but that's not a really very important aspect. What is important is this variable called the dimension scale. And on architectural dimensions, we'll want to set this as either 12, 24, 48, a multiple of 12, and what it does is it calculates into the scale factor. If we leave it at 1 and we create a dimension on here, and so we'll say OK, and we'll set that current, and we'll close this. And then I'll turn off the dimensions. So good dimensioning technique would be to create dimensions on a dimension layer. And so I'll turn off that layer. And it turns off the current layer, so I'll make a second layer for example purposes. And so I'll go to my dimension layer and create a new layer. And I'll just call it dim2. And so I've got my dimension 2 layer. I'm going to make that current, and I'm going to close that. And then remember that I created a dimension style, okay? And so the dimension styles will show continuing. So here's my standard dimension style. I'm going to choose the standard, and then when I put a dimension on, I can choose the dimension automatic, and it'll place that dimension. And what we'll notice is that it's very, very small, and that's because the dimension style scale needs to be set. On architectural drawings, it's especially important. And so as we look at this standard style and we modify it, if we set this at 12, then that would be the scale that we would use for 1 inch equals a foot. And we can close that. We can set a current, close it. And you'll notice that it will update. And then if we go back to our dimension style again, modify it, 24. And you'll see that it updates for that scale as well. And so as we work with dimensions and dimension scales, we want to be able to set up our dimension scale factor in the tab marked Fit. And the way that works is that we can either set it as the inverse of the plot scale, like 1 inch equals a foot would be 12, and then we can calculate like 1/4 of an inch equals a foot would be 48. And then we would be able to create that dimension style based on how we would set up that viewport. Another way that we can create dimension styles is to set them up so that we can have the viewport scale be a factor. And this is a great way to work on dimensions. And so I can go to my paper space, double click in the viewport, and then I can set that viewport scale. And so if I wanted to set that at 1/4 of an inch equals a foot, it's a bit small. But if I set it up at 1 inch equals a foot, and this was our scale factor that we had talked about being 12, that works just fine. And then what we want to do is we want to lock it. We can go into our dimension style manager, and then we can modify it, and we'll make a new one for this. We'll say new, and we'll say standard viewport. And then on the fit tab, we'll set that to scale dimensions to layout. And this will automatically calculate the dimension text height, provided that we're working within a viewport in Paperspace. And so we check off scale dimension to layout, and then we say OK, and then we'll make that standard viewport layer current, and we'll close that, and then we'll go to our dimension layer. And so here we are on our dim2 layer, and then we can go and create a dimension. And this will automatically scale your dimensions to the viewport scale. And this is an excellent way to be able to work with dimensions without having to calculate out the viewport scale. Alrighty. So as we take a look at the textbook will go through the Lines tab, and then being able to change line types, which we really want to keep these as continuous lines, so we don't want to make changes to that. Line weights, I'll typically put a 0.3 millimeter line weight, and it's according to a standard that we have, ASME Y14.2. And then some of these other dimensional standards are kind of more for your CAD manager, things like dimension line spacing and dimension line ticks and things like that. So as we go through and we start to work with our dimensions and our dimension styles, just keep this as a reference, because we don't necessarily have to know how to do all of these different aspects. On the Symbols and Arrows tab, this is where we're going to set up the different arrowheads or terminators. We're going to use architectural ticks on our architectural drawings, and we're going to use arrowheads on our mechanical drawings. And then if we wanted to work with leaders, we can work with these leaders, and they also have a dimension style. Center marks are controlled in that tab where we can set the center mark, and then when we put a center mark on a drawing, so for example, if I have a mechanical drawing and I go to model space, and we can erase this center mark right here, and then we can place it in again by going to the center line layer, and on our annotate tab we can say center mark, and then we can click on either an arc or a circle, and then once we select that arc, it will create the center mark for us. And that center mark then is controlled within here, within the dimensioning style under Symbols and Arrows, and we can either have that set as mark or line. The text tab allows us to change the text font. We talked a little bit about that. I showed how to change from an Arial text font to a City Blueprint. And then as far as the text height, we set it here, and I set mine for 0.125. And that way, when we work with the Fit tab, what the Fit tab will do is it will automatically increase the text height per our scale factor. And that's what we want to be able to do. And so on our Fit tab here, we can either calculate out the dimension scale, or we can use the scale to dimensions and layout. And so, for example, on a mechanical drawing, if we wanted to look at our fit tab and our dimension scale, we can come into our dimension by typing in DDIM. And then if I wanted to modify that, it's the same as we were working with architectural drawings. We want to set the colors by layer, by block. Not a lot on the lines tab. Symbols and arrows, we'll leave these set as closed filled. Text, I'm going to check the font here, and the text is set for Arial, which is fine. I'm just going to leave that alone. And the text height, when we're working in dimension styles, stays 0. And then the text height here is where the scale factor would be applied. So I'm going to dial this down to 0.125 or 1/8 of an inch. And then the text placement, centered, horizontal, this looks fine. Fit. On the Fit tab, if we have this set up at 1, we can then we can place that text and it'll come in at a 1/8 of an inch or 0.125 text height. But if we scale this to half scale, then what we would do is we would update this to 2, and then it would scale our dimensions, arrowheads appropriately to be the right size on the printed paper. And so if I say OK to that and close it, and then I go to the Layout tab, here in the Layout tab would be how that dimension style would be displayed. And so if I were to go to Model Space and put another 1-inch dimension on that, another linear dimension. And so that's my dimension for that linear dimension. And then we can also update things like our units, primary units. And so number of decimal places is controlled here. If I have 1 decimal place of accuracy and say OK, close that, you'll notice that it dials it down. We can also set up our drawing for dual dimensioning. And so if we're working with a manufacturing company that uses millimeters or metric units, we can put in a multiplier for the metric scale factor and have it dual dimension our dimensions by checking that off. And then lastly, we can apply tolerances. And so if we were working on a mechanical part that had some tolerances, say plus or minus 0.003, we can apply those tolerances within the drawing, and then we can see that within the drawing itself. It's a little confusing when it's dual dimensioned, meaning alternate units, both inches and millimeters. If we OK that, close that. And we go into dimensioning and tolerancing quite a bit in our CAD 117 because we wouldn't be tolerancing angles and things like that, but we would be adding dimensional tolerances to other mechanical prints. Alrighty. So the scale factor is the important component as we start to work with our mechanical drawings and architectural drawings. In architectural drawings, we'll calculate them out 12, 24, 48, or we'll dimension them to layout. And it does a good job of demonstrating how to dimension things using layout, scale to layout. Here's our alternate units section. Here's our tolerances tab. And so we can add a tolerance like 3 inches plus 0.03 or minus 0.02. And that's typical in manufacturing. It's not common to have something exactly perfect. There's always a little bit of variance, and this lets the designer put the amount of variance on the print so that the part is workable. Dimensions are associative, meaning that if we modify the part, we can have our dimensions updated. Here's the information on dim scale and being able to calculate out a dim scale. So like on a mechanical, this would be for a half scale. We can override our dimensions, update them. Annotative dimensionings are a fairly complicated area. We'll cover those in one of the advanced classes. And then this goes through how to dimension in a viewport or in paper space. And so this is content is applicable. Typically we'll use architectural drawings when we scale the viewport or scale the dimensions within the viewport. And that's set by setting the viewport scale. Annotative dimensioning will automatically increase or decrease the dimension size, and we really don't use those in our basic course. But the textbook has a good reference if you are interested in. And then things like aligning dimensions and obliquing them would be techniques that we would use for things like orthographic drawing or isometric drawing. And so there's these small tweaks that we can implement to make our dimensions look proper. But as we go through and work with dimensioning, I do know how to teach isometric drawing, and I'm good at it. I used to teach it up at NIU with a pencil, but modeling is a much stronger way to work these days. And so the time it takes to create an isometric drawing could be creating a solid model in the same amount of time or less. And so we don't do a lot of isometric dimensioning. And that brings us to the chapter exercises, and this completes this video lecture.